Nate here, and welcome to part 3 of how to build your Magic the Gathering deck. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, part 1 is for anybody who doesn't know where to start. They want to get started making a deck, but they don't know where to begin. If you're in that scenario, then that's a good video to start. Part 2 is more practical. That's how much mana do you put in your deck, what kind of mana. It also talks a little bit about mana curve, which is very important when building a deck. And here is part 3, testing and tweaking. This is the last step before you can call your deck done, if you ever can call your deck done. I ended last week's video talking about adding mana to your deck and then shuffling it up and doing some sample hands, some sample opening hands. This is to figure out, do you have enough mana in the deck? Do you have not enough? How are your spells working out? How is your curve looking? Are you getting spells that you can cast in the early game? These are things you want to look at when you're drawing these cards. I also suggest that you draw a couple of cards as if you're going through your turns a couple of times to see what you're getting as the game would progress. For those of you familiar with the channel, you know that I have already done a video on gold fishing. You can check it out, link in the description down below. And I talk about specifically completely solo gold fishing. If you're not aware, gold fishing is the practice of playing Magic by yourself. One deck, playing the game, pretending you have an opponent, but just basically trying to win. There's other ways to goldfish as well. Some people like to goldfish with 2 decks, where you play the role of both yourself and your opponent. And you can do that when testing a deck, and this gives you a slightly better idea of how well your deck will work. But I still say that this is vastly different than if you were actually playing a game of Magic against an opponent. Because when you're goldfishing, even with 2 decks and you're earnestly playing both decks, you still know what your opponent has. You still know what your opponent plans to do. It's really hard to recreate the fog of war when goldfishing 2 decks against yourself. But I do highly encourage that you goldfish because it gives you a lot of good information. It tells you, is the mana curve in your deck working? Do you have too much mana? Not enough. It also can tell you how your draws will be working throughout the game. And what I think is one of the most important things that goldfishing can teach you is if your deck is working. It can't necessarily tell you how good your deck is. It can really only tell you if your deck works in optimal scenarios. But if your deck isn't working while you're goldfishing, that means it's not working under an optimal scenario. And if that's happening, if you're goldfishing and the deck just isn't working, it isn't doing what you expected it to do, then that means you need to go back to the drawing board. Maybe these cards don't work as well together as you thought they did. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing because it's showing you where you can improve your deck and any blind spots you may have had. One other thing goldfishing does that I like is it teaches you your deck. It tells you how your deck works together. It sets you up so that way the first time you sit down with a live opponent, you're pretty sure how it's going to behave. You might be surprised at how disruption does affect it, and that is one thing that you can only get in an actual game of Magic. But it still gives you a base level of knowledge of the deck that can help you when you're playing a live game. Now, you can only goldfish for so long before it gets boring. You're going to need to test it against a live opponent. After you've goldfished and you've adjusted and you've gotten the deck to the point where it's working well while you're playing it by yourself, it's working well while you're playing it by yourself against another deck, now it's time to actually play a live opponent. And here is where the real test comes in. This is where you see how the deck does. You may lose this game. That might happen. And that's fine, but you're going to get a lot of really good information. It's going to tell you, again, any holes you may have, any things you need to address. Are you not getting to the amount of mana that you need? Is the actual disruption that you're getting too much and dismantling the deck too quickly? Something they teach with movies and television and that sort of thing is there shouldn't be anything included in the finished product that doesn't help the story in some way, doesn't move the plot along, typically. You know, there are exceptions, like with anything, but I view building decks in the same way. There shouldn't be a card in the deck that isn't helping you towards your goal. Now, for most of us, that goal is winning. So if the goal of the deck is to get your opponent to 0, then everything in that deck needs to work toward that end. If the goal is getting your opponent to 0 cards in their library, then it needs to work toward that end. It might not be winning. You might be trying to get a particular combo off that might win you the game, but really you just want to get the combo off, then everything in your deck should work toward that end. You don't want to have anything in there that isn't going to help you toward your goal. And that's what all of this is. From the point where you figured out what type of deck you wanted to make and what goal you were working toward, until now, all of this has been getting to the point where you've built a deck that is going to do what you want it to do. So you want to make sure that there are no cards in the deck that aren't helping you with that. If a card isn't helping you do what you want to do, then why is it in your deck? And your goal can be to have fun. If the deck does something that doesn't necessarily win you the game, but you enjoy doing it, then make sure every card in the deck gets you to do that thing. That's the important piece. It all comes down to you, what kind of deck you want, and what you want to do with it. And at this point, your deck is done. But for me, a deck is never done. I'm always pulling them apart, putting them back together, trying new things. A new set comes out with a new card. Boseiju went basically in every deck I own, even the black-red ones. I'm always tweaking and working towards making my deck different, better, fun, but it's all up to you. Or you could just ignore me and net deck. Click on that. This show is part of the CIP network, inspiring creativity, one episode at a time.